I'm going to begin work on cleaning this Retina type 010 prior to reassembling it. So I normally just start with the body shell, and basically you just need to check it and make sure, see what sort of a state it's in to start off with. This one is particularly clean, I have to say. Normally I would start with a brush, just brush out any dust. If there's any sand, make a note of it. You're going to have to clean it a little bit harder. But basically that looks very clean in there. So I'll just puff that through, blow any dust off the inside of the bellows. I'm just looking at the inside now, and that'll require a little wipe of solvent just to make sure that the surface in particular of this spring here, which bears up on the film spool, the take-up spool, just making sure that's clear of any of the old grease, because the old grease will have dried out and probably gathered up some dust. You might see that that Q-tip there that I'd used with a bit of Ronsonol has come off pretty clean, so that means that there's virtually nothing there. Right, I'm just checking anything else I need to wipe. Pressure plate's quite clean. Sometimes with old cameras you'll find that if a film's been left in there for a long time, particularly if the storage has been damp, you will get pieces of the film backing actually stuck to the pressure plate, and that'll all need to come off, because otherwise it'll leave tram lines on the back of the film as it gets dragged through the camera when you're winding on film. That one looks quite good. There's a ghost of a thumbprint on there, which may or may not clean off. It's of no consequence. I'm checking the action of the sprocket shaft here to make sure that's smooth. If there was any hint of corrosion or roughness there, I would disassemble that. And the shaft actually lifts up through the top, but to lift it up you would need to remove a set screw here and one up here too, one up here, and then the shaft would lift out. There's virtually nothing to it, and there's virtually nothing to go wrong there. Very occasionally you might see a problem with that part. I can remember one camera I dealt with, this particular screw had backed out so that the film wasn't, as the film was being drawn through the camera, it was moving that sprocket wheel, but the gear on the top wasn't rotating, and so that it didn't meter the film going through the camera correctly. But that was very unusual. Right, so much for the inside of the camera. On the top, again I'll just be checking this to see if there's any signs of sand or grit or dust or any build-up of any old dried out grease really. So I'd normally just, with a bit of solvent on that cotton bud, just check that that gear is, the teeth are all clear, that there's nothing in there. And then I'll just swab around the inside of the top here. This is where the take-up, the spool, the drive for the take-up spool runs through there. And just clean up that top plate generally. Now there's nothing on there to speak of. This camera just looks like a new one. I mean, I've done a fair bit of wiping and it hasn't really made much difference. On the base of the camera, what's important here? Well, there's nothing we need to take off. This glue is the original adhesive. It's flat, it's well stuck. There's no need for me to strip that. The leather will glue back down over the top of that. One thing to watch with any of the Kodaks is that the tripod socket, the screws holding it often come loose. So always check those to see if they're tight, and in this case they're fine. There's no movement there at all to the screwdriver. So the base of the camera is good. I'm checking the action here of the catch for the front. That looks good. I'll give that a quick sweep out with a brush. You just need a cheap 1/2 inch saw. what's this, 19mm paintbrush. The cheap ones are just ideal for that. So I'll just give that a quick sweep out. Give it a blowout to remove any dust. Bit of solvent on that cotton bud again. Yeah, this rod here, the shutter release action on the front standard, that runs on there, so I need to wipe that down just to make sure I get rid of any contaminants or dried out grease. There's one spring here in this camera. Some models have 2 springs. That job is solely to give it a little bit of impetus to pop the bellows when you open the camera. When you open the front, it just gives a little bit of a thump to pop the bellows open. Don't lose too much sleep if it's broken, it won't be the end of the world. Alright, so just wipe all those surfaces, make sure they're all clean. The paint is of a variable quality on the inside of there. The casting there is relatively rough, but of course you can't see any of that, and it doesn't make any difference at all. Just wipe the front of those bellows. They've only used one cotton bud to do this whole job. It's dirty now, but if that was a typical dirty old greasy camera, you'd go through 3 or 4 doing that job. Right, so that's basically the body shell cleaned up, ready to be reassembled. Next piece, what have we got here? Right, so we've got the front door. Things to note here, basically, just check to see what sort of state the dirt is. And if it was showing any corrosion, you need to be a lot more gentle with your cleaning, because you will easily wipe off any paint, and then you've got to put it back or leave it bare. So don't get too enthusiastic, don't rub too hard. Just whip any dust out of here. The scuff mark on the front, that will be that somebody had not returned the lens to infinity position before they forced the front closed, or alternatively they had some filter fitted to the front which was basically stuck out too far. They weren't able to close the camera properly. So I'm just wiping those surfaces just to make sure they're clean. I note in this case that the leather is just slightly loose at this front edge, and I'll probably put a little spot of glue under there and glue that down neat. That's where you catch your thumb against it to pull open the front. So if you left that up there, and it would just get worse and worse until it tore off. So that will all glue down that back down. The top. Alright, what have we got here? There's a few little bits and pieces. So this is just the cover for the viewfinder, and that I'll need to move this over a bit. I think I've wandered. All I'm doing there is just making sure I lift off any dust, because I don't want it to fall back down onto the viewfinder lenses later. That's that little spring section that holds the lenses, the front and rear lens of the viewfinder in place, and that looks okay. Just making sure that's nice and clean. Here's that chrome top plate from the top of the camera, and all I'm doing is just wiping that down to remove any oil or dirt. It's chromed, usually cleans up very well. This has got a bit of a slight curve to it, and I will have to see if I can get that to lie a bit flatter, and I'm just checking at what point it bends, because it's got a fairly sharp bend. That'll be harder to get out. That looks okay, that should be fine. And the top cover itself, we've got nothing in this. We've removed the viewfinder, so all I need to do is just wipe that round with a bit of solvent on the cotton bud, wipe that edge, and it's just to make sure there's no grease or dirt on there, so that when we do assemble it, it will be nice and sparkly clean. Just wipe around that top, wipe around the edges. I can see here, looking closely, and you probably can't see that, there's a line round at that point. Now that line means that the take-up knob has scuffed it at that point. It's scuffed into the surface, which may explain why that washer was there, in order to bring up the height of the advanced knob to stop that happening. I'll certainly check that when I assemble it, and if I decide it needs an even thicker washer, I'll put one in place. Right, so that's that, done. So there's not an awful lot to this, it's just tedious. Doesn't require a great deal of extra skill. So the struts. So generally speaking, on the struts there will be grease. There needs to be grease because they don't work well dry. The grease over the fullness of time will have gathered up all manner of dirt and grit, and that all needs to be cleaned away. So I concentrate on this part. That's the piece that goes to the back of the camera. That's right up against the back. And start with another cotton bud. The chromed struts, again I'll do those surfaces. This camera, as I said, is unusually clean. For a camera to be this clean, it means that it was probably bought, probably ran a film or two, and then either because the owner went on to bigger and brighter things, or found it too complicated and went to something simpler, it's spent the rest of its life at the back of the dresser, only to come out when they were clearing the estate typically. So the camera's done virtually no work. It's far too clean to have been used frequently, given that it's a camera from the 40s. It's a long time ago. So I'm quite happy with that. Now I'm looking at the action here of the shutter release components in particular. There's a bit of chrome loss along that edge. It's not significant. Making sure that all moves smoothly. This is the arm that pulls down the release on the shutter. This arm here pushes that down in due course. That's the shutter release works off this basically. This part going inside the body, this part being outwards. So I'm just checking this, looking closely to make sure everything is sitting fairly straight and level. It looks good. The disposition of the arms on the struts. With these cross arms, the inner ones are flat. They're normally flat. That's how they're intended to be. The outer arms on that cross, they're usually bent. They're not bent much, but they are bent so that they are effectively dished in the centre. And this top one here, the ends are brought upwards. So basically it means that when this is contained in the body, you can see how it's sprung out. When that's contained in the body, it means it's under tension. When that end's under tension, it means that these ends are under tension, and that means that they will pop up into the lock position smoothly. So I'm checking to make sure that the inner arms are dead flat, that they haven't got a bend on them. And there's a slight bend here, and I'll kick that up. That end is skewed downwards. I'll square that up. A little bit on the other end too, but no great deal. And I'm checking that the outer arms have got a bit of a bend to them, just to make sure that those ends pop up into position. That looks good. So I'll need a pair of pliers just to give a tweak to this end and that end where I'd said that they were not quite right. I'll find the pliers. I'm just checking I was bend, make sure that is square to the end, square to the arm, and again at that one. That's it. There's virtually nothing involved there. That would hardly have moved anything. So there's the bellows struts, and they are ready to be, they're all cleaned and they'll be ready to go back in the camera. We'll lubricate those before they go in. What's next on the agenda? Oh, this. So here we have the focus ring, focus scale ring. So normally there's a bit of grease on this. It's grease that's come out from the focus helical, and usually this is quite dirty. So you want to get all that muck off. Again, wipe around the inside. Again, I'm just using a cotton bud with a bit of solvent on it. Just make sure I've got all that off. I'm looking at the state of this ring. Now where the fixing screws that hold this to the helical are attached, I can see some distortion here, there and there. It's in more than one place and they're not evenly distributed. That means this ring has probably slipped at some stage or been forced. And I'm just going to roll those raised pieces back down, and I'm doing this just by pushing them down basically with the end of the screwdriver. I'm not going to hammer them down, and I'm most certainly not going to file them down because I don't want to remove that metal. I just want to push it back where it came from, so that that surface is flat again, and that's all that's required. I'm just checking this ring. Now with the type 010, the chroming was often, particularly the early ones, the chroming was not up to much at all. I think from looking at them that basically they'd chromed them straight over the steel. Good chroming, normally there would be, ideally with chroming, I think they have 3 coats. They put a copper base coat, a nickel coat over the top, and then the chrome on the top of that. Typically I think these ones they've skipped, there's no copper. I think they probably even skipped the nickel, and the chrome went straight onto the steel, or brass in this case. And often often for one reason or another it's let go. Now it probably means corrosion's got underneath it, but you will find with the type 010, 010, that often you'll see very poor chroming on this focus scale ring. It's just typical for the model. It's something that gets a fair bit of handling. Your fingers will be on that as you adjust the focus, and your perspiration, the acid in your perspiration, that will etch into it. And if it's a poor chrome job, that's exactly what happens. Because this camera's seen so little use, the chrome's in very good condition. It's quite common to see that very poor indeed. Right, so that piece is done. Well, I think we get on to the messy stuff now. Okay, so I'll get ready to do this. Time for the messy, but the focus helical is always the messiest bit to try and clean. This has the most grease, and it's always the dirtiest and the stickiest. So we'll see how we get on with this lot. I usually do them piece by piece. I usually start with this piece. So what have we got? Right, I usually use a toothpick just to remove the hardest stuff in here. This grease is often dried right out. It goes like a wax. Sometimes it can dry right out and it looks like a very dry and useless candle wax. So I'm scraping off the bulk of this that I can. Just use a toothpick for this, don't use a screwdriver or anything metal. You'll end up damaging the mount, and then there would be a lot of work getting things to run smoothly later. Alright, that's lifted off the worst of it. Now I'll attack that with a bit of solvent. First I'll try some Ronsonol and see how that goes. If it's not too hard and dry, that'll lift it. That's doing quite a reasonable job. Sometimes if it's dried out, gone very waxy, this won't even touch it, and you have to get on to more exciting solvents. But start with the simple stuff. I mean, leave the stuff that makes you grow another head when you really need to use it. So I'm just starting from the top surface and working my way in, really. This is where you really cut through the cotton buds. It's coming away quite well. A lot of that dried out grease will have more or less embedded itself into the surface of the metal. The metal's not exactly polished smooth, so it's got a bit of a grain to it. That stuff will be down in the surface, it'll be making it a bit sticky. Once we've got fresh lubricant on there, that probably wouldn't make much difference, but I like to get rid of all of that old rubbish. So that's pretty good. Now I'm just checking here now, because obviously I couldn't get my cotton bud down into this gap. There'll be a little bit of dirt down there too that I want out. So here I take a cotton bud and I crush it down flat with my pliers, get that down very thin, stick some solvent on it, and I can work it into that gap. I don't want to distort that guide piece there. That serves to stop the inner helical rotating, so that it is driven forward and backwards by the rotation of the outer helical. And if you bend those pieces, that inner will not move forward smoothly and back and forward smoothly at all. It'll just jam, making the focus quite stiff. So that looks quite good. So now I'm just wiping around the outside of the housing, just to lift off any dust and dirt, any old grease. It gives me a chance to have a look at it. This camera is unusual. Here, this felt washer that we have here, normally that covers the entire back. Normally it's cut that shape. In this case it's just a washer. I don't remember seeing that before. As I say, various changes were made during production. Methods were tried and then abandoned. That's probably one of them. Right, so that piece is all clean, can go to one side. What have we got here? Oh, the inner and outer helical. Yes, well, we'll start with the outer and start cleaning that up. Use the same technique with a stick to remove the bulk of that dried grease. It's very hard, very dry. Well, the camera in its infinite wisdom had decided that it had enough life out of that battery and stopped. So we'll pick up where we left off. So I was busy cleaning this piece, getting off the worst of the grease. It's very hard, thick and dry, bit of a mess. Excuse me, someone at the door. Must be a day for interruptions. Back where I was. Right, that's very nasty. Let's get some solvent on here and see if we can clean it up. So we'll start with this and see if it'll come off. That's looking pretty promising. So basically I'm cleaning up all these external surfaces, and then we'll deal with the threaded section. Now I'm going to wipe the inside through. There's a multi-start thread, so I just go right round it, rotating the cotton bud as I go to lift that rubbish out, and then in the other direction. And I'm just trying to lift all that dried grease and filth out of those threads. That's the first stage, that's okay. We'll move on to dealing with this piece. That's the inner. That's a bit nasty looking. Follow much the same procedure. Wiping through the inside there, lift out any dirt and rubbish. This is the front surface, and you can see the scribe marks I put in there to help me position it. I'm just cleaning the front surface at the moment. Now the threads. Much the same deal. I rotate the cotton bud as I go. I'm wanting to lift any dirt and dried grease out of those threads. They don't exactly come up sparkly, as you can see. Alright, well, it's that buried in filth there. I'm just going to fold that surface in on this paper serviette, and we'll do this again. These threads look a little bit damaged to me at the back there. I'm not sure what would have caused that. Perhaps somebody had a trouble getting it to start when they were screwing it in. It's very unusual. This is the back edge. You can see the groove in there. The front surface is just plain. Couple of little holes. Alright, we'll try that. So we'll take our outer and our inner, screw them together. Multi-start thread, you've got to roll it backwards until you feel the thread drop in. Now I run a bit of solvent on there, and then I'll work that backwards and forwards, and basically that'll lift and shift loose grease on those working surfaces. And I can feel it, I'm feeling the metal to metal contact there. So I know I'm getting that clean. That's good. So, a bit of solvent on the cotton bud. Roll that out, not all the way. You want to leave it engaged, and I'll run that cotton bud round there. Lift off any grease, you can see it's coming clean. Do the same in the other direction. That's lifting all the dirt off that inner. Screw that back to expose the thread on the inner, and I'm doing the same, rolling any of that filth out, and the same in the other direction. So we have those surfaces clean. It's a bit of the inner never goes back and be behind the surface of the outer. So it only goes that far. So I'm just checking the feel of this, make sure that it revolves smoothly. There's a little hint of roughness there. So I know that there's a bit of distortion or something, or those threads at the back didn't look all that pretty, so it's probably one of those. And I've just got a bit of solvent on there. I'm just working that. I haven't put any abrasive on there. If it was really rough, I'd put a dab of Brasso in there, work it backwards and forwards many times until we'd polish down any high spots. I don't feel the need to do that with this. That feels good. Alright. Once more with the solvent to lift off any dirt and grease. You can see that the cotton tip is coming off pretty clean now, so there's virtually nothing happening. We've got all the grease and rubbish off there. That feels nice and smooth. So that part's done. Of course we have to align this before I lubricate it. Now I've got my alignment marks. I've got two scrapes. I've got marks where I've got marks. There are multiple marks on this ring. I didn't put that one there or that one there. There's a double line there and a single line there. And on our inner, there is our single line, and there was the double line. One of them was behind that hole. It hardly shows. You can see that they are not up to the surface, so I've got to rotate that one position, bring it back round. It's still below the surface on the inner. Rotate it back one more position, drop it back into the thread, wind it up, still below the surface, one more. Where are we now? Okay. Alright. So now, when the front surfaces are level, that line lines up there. These two lines, the one that you can't really see there by that hole, they line up there. Now that is the correct alignment for those two components. I'm just making sure that they do revolve smoothly, and they will be lubricated and put back into the mount. Here's the mount there. Now we can have a quick look at this. We can check this and see if it's going to run smoothly. So I'll drop this into position. Now I know it's sat like that because the inner was slightly proud of the outer. That just dropped straight into that mount, which is a very good sign. It means that it's probably going to revolve smoothly. And you can see it does. As I revolve it, the inner just runs in and out. Those parts are done. I'll pop them to one side. Here we have the plate that holds everything together. Again, this will just be the same dried grease, and so that needs to just come off. In this particular case, the solvent I'm using, Ronsonol cigarette lighter fluid, is doing the job very well. That's quite a mild solvent. very inoffensive to work with. Don't be smoking when you're using it, you'll set the place alight, but otherwise it's good. So there, I've just cleaned that. All the filth came off that very well indeed. That part can go to one side. So those components are ready, they're cleaned, ready to go. That's probably about where's our take-up spool? We'll do that while we're here. The take-up spool is Bakelite or some very similar thermosetting plastic. I'm just giving that a wipe with a bit of solvent to lift off any grease. There's not much coming off there. On the base we know there was some grease, I'd made mention of it earlier. That was quite sticky, it had gone very sticky and waxy. That came off, there wasn't much there again. And I'll just wipe out the centre where that rolls round on the boss in the bottom of the camera. And that basically is that. There's no real need to wipe these surfaces, they will have finger grease on them and nothing worse than that. So there's our spool. The other components I tend to clean them as I'm ready to put them back in the body. So I think that's that part of the job done.